Mogherini.
Thank you, President. Let me start with the issue of the definition of genocide, because it is not for being reticent that I have not addressed this issue in my opening remarks, but because the definition of genocide answers to very precise criteria on a juridical basis, and this work is ongoing in the competent institutions, which is in the United Nations, in that appropriate framework. The only reference so far to genocide in UN documents is the one made last year on the 13th of March 2015 in the report of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the human rights situation in Iraq and in light of abuses committed by the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant and associated groups. And this report compiles information about acts of violence perpetrated against civilians because of their affiliation or perceived affiliation to an ethnic or religious group. And this report concludes that some of these violences, considering the overall information, may constitute genocide in the case of the Yazidis, and other violence may amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes when it comes to Christians, Turkmen, Sabea, Mandaeans, Kakae, Kurds and Shia. This is, if we want to be precise and consistent with the legal framework we are dealing with, because many of you made reference to the fact that it's not just a word, but it has legal implications. This is the legal framework in which we're acting. And be sure that we are working, you know very well, the European Union as such has not a seat in the United Nations. We can open this debate if you want the next time. But we are following these developments inside the appropriate frameworks, which are the ones of the United Nations. But let me also stress that in parallel to that, we have to act concretely and not just take a principled approach, which is indeed extremely relevant, because the region is looking at us also, and the minorities are looking at those that can defend them with words that are also important and with acts. Let me start by something that was mentioned in a very concrete way by one of you, the issue of justice and accountability. Because as I mentioned before, but let me underline it again, the European Union supports the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, which collects evidence on the violations committed. This is extremely relevant in view of future legal actions. And the European Union, as was underlined by one of your interventions, indeed has called for the UN Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Let me make these 2 points very clear. Let me also stress, to conclude, because I am also aware we are running late, I do not want to contribute too much to being even more late, that there are 3-4 things that it is absolutely priority for us to do in order to protect religious minorities in the Middle East. First, liberate the areas that have been occupied by Daesh, in Iraq and in Syria in particular, and make them safe, make the normal life go back in these areas. And this is where our humanitarian assistance comes. In Iraq, because we have more access and we can support more access there, and hopefully more and more in Syria. Second, create the conditions for inclusive communities and societies in these countries. I would say recreate the conditions, because we are talking, as many of you have underlined, of societies that for centuries, if not thousands of years, have been living together in peace and understanding each other, living together, finding these differences as a source of richness of the societies. And here comes a point that is particularly relevant to me, even more than from a political point of view, from a human point of view. And I'm surprised this was not coming up today in the debate, because this is, as far as I have heard from the Christians, for instance, in Erbil last year, the issue that they are debating the most, which is Is it safer for us? Is it better for us to stay in the Middle East or to leave? With all the debate about preserving or recreating the plurality in the societies of the Middle East. This is a debate that, in particular, the Christian communities in the regions that were occupied by Daesh in Iraq are posing themselves. And this is a debate, I believe, that we have first of all to respect, to follow carefully. It's our own debate, but I believe also we have the duty to offer them the possibility to have the option to create safe conditions to leave the areas. And this goes back to what some of you have underlined, the support to refugees, all refugees, including the ones that are coming from minority backgrounds, and protecting their rights wherever they are, in whatever place in the region they are, and also creating the conditions for them to stay or to return to their communities if they wish to do so, in order to preserve or restore the plurality of societies in the Middle East, which is, I personally believe, in itself a value, because that is one of the places of the world where different backgrounds, different religions, different communities, different ethnicities have been living and showing to the world the possibility of living together. And then we have to do the big thing, end the conflict, because that is, at the end of the day, what allows minorities to go back. And an additional point, that is what comes together and after that. And sometimes also not in places where conflicts are, but in places that are getting close to crises that are becoming major ones, which means investing in the openness of societies, in the democracy of the institutions, in the respect of human rights and rule of law, in pluralism and inclusiveness in the countries around the world, everywhere, not only in the Middle East. Now we're talking about a specific case, the case of Daesh, but as many of you mentioned, this is something that happens everywhere in the world, in Africa, in Asia. Don't forget Libya, where we had victims, Christians of different origins, Ethiopia or Egypt, killed even recently. We have to look at the bigger picture. So act immediately with all our support, humanitarian support first of all, work on the conditions for the respect of minorities and pluralism and inclusiveness in the immediate and in the long term, and put all our diplomatic efforts to put an end to the crisis and to defeat, in this case, the big source of problems for the religious minorities in the Middle East, which is Daesh. Thank you.